Through this interview process, I read to the spiritual leaders 4 different pieces of scripture from the Gospel of Matthew. I then asked them to interpret those pieces of scripture historically instead of spiritually. Not necessarily whether or not these pieces of scriptures actually happened throughout history, but what the historicity was of what actually took place. Unfortunately, Rabbi Fred was unable to meet in person, and so we had to do the interview over the phone. This is a recording of our interview.
All right. My sense is that he was coming from a very Jewish point of view, in which the rules, the laws, the commandments, and in this case, the tradition of healing, which is a whole separate subject, goes back into the Hebrew Scriptures, Elisha, Elijah. What was saying is, I'm really supposed to just deal with the Jewish community. But then after the conversation, he said, you are a person of faith. You do deserve intervention and relationship. And so he would help. And I think that today is probably a more modernistic, certainly a reform point of view, that while we today as Jews in the modernist community are focused on our community, at the same time it does not, in every case, in every situation, exclude others as well. We've become more universal. Others in the Jewish community and the Orthodox community would say, no, we restrict our observances and our traditions only for ourselves. We're not supposed to engage others. They find God on their own. So those are the 2 traditions within Judaism, and possibly within contemporary Christianity too, but that's a separate issue. Okay, there's a lot of question about this. First of all, the temple area was not the temple. Okay, as I understand it from the readings I've done, this was the external area before you came to the temple, not the courtyard, but the plaza around there. And a good analogy, and this is strictly an analogy, is in today's language, if you were going to a baseball game or a football game, a sporting event or a concert inside the stadium, that's one thing. Outside today, again, you have a lot of vendors. They sell programs, they sell concessions, they sell foods. There's a lot of, and very commercial, and of course you have your choice of doing that or not. The problem with the temple area is that when people would arrive to pay their tax, to bring the animals, they would have to change their animals or their grains. They'd have to have it weighed. They would have to have it cashed, whatever. And so a whole cottage industry grew up around there to help the people do what they need to. But like all commercial enterprises, there was a certain amount of, graft, a certain amount of, profiteering, what have you. And I think that's what he objected to. This is supposed to be a spiritual experience, and yet we have all of these people outside here making money off of it in an unfair way. So was it historic? Yeah, and of course this would be an act of civic upset and unrest, interfering with the local businesses. He's making a point that there's a spiritual protest. So yeah, historically it happened, maybe not exactly in that way or to the extent, but no doubt that incident would probably in some way happen. He reflected his protest, because that's very consistent with his message and philosophy throughout.
Whether that actually happened is anybody's guess.
Right.
The historical accuracy that Jesus encouraged his followers to pay the taxes that were due seems to be accurate enough, because it follows then in other New Testament writings, whether it's the Acts of the Apostles or Paul's writings about the kind of respect that Christians are to have for those who are in Jesus is saying that the temple tax should be paid even by the subjects, then the case can be made that that indeed is what happened here. The whole thing about coin in the mouth of the fish may be a little bit of hyperbole,
Right.
but that was also very common in Jesus' time. It's not so uncommon in our time either.
Right. What do you think the coin in the mouth of the fish meant?
Not sure. I really, I mean, for something like that, I'd have to really do some background reading on my own, but off the top of my head, I don't know. Okay?
Okay. Any interpretations on how
From-
he treated the woman?
Well, you know, in one respect, his initial treatment of her could be seen as being almost derogatory. Okay? Don't take the food from dogs. Okay? There's something persistent about her. And if you know anything about the culture of that place over there, you still see that. It's not just women, but the populace in general tends to be very, very persistent to each other. And when their passions will boil, they tend to stay on top of what it is they want. So I can certainly see where historically this story may be fairly accurate. Okay, and notice that she is described as a Canaanite woman who was considered an outcast in Jewish society.
That's one of the most troubling passages in the New Testament to a lot of people, and it is to me when you take it on the surface. But when you take it on the surface, it is an indication of Jesus conforming to the expectations of the age and the customs of the age. Women had a second-class kind of existence, though Jesus was very much one who looked upon women not as property or not as a lot as inferior, but in many ways as cultural equals. The words that he speaks sound offensive to us, and they are offensive to us. But I think the end of that, and I don't doubt the historicity of that at all, but the end of that is that Jesus goes from there back into Jewish lands, fully Jewish lands, with the understanding that he is sent not only to the lost children of Israel, but to all the world's lost children. When he goes to the cross, he goes there to die for all the people of the world, not just for the people of Israel. And so I've always looked at it as a kind of epiphany on the part of Jesus, that in that moment he realized that his mission really was much broader than what he may have understood. It's also a way of saying to the church, not just Jews belong to Christ, but all of those who confess his name, come to him in faith, such as this woman came to him, belong to him and belong to the Christian community. It was a radical thing, especially for the early church, who struggled with whether Jews and Gentiles could be together in the same community of faith. Another, you chose some really wonderfully difficult passages here. And I think in that passage that Jesus is affirming that the law is God's gracious gift to the people of Israel, and it is given to them, and given to us, not as a means of attaining salvation, but as a means of knowing how we are to live as those who have already been claimed and marked as God's own. And from our perspective, as God's own in Jesus Christ, the law applies to us as well. It's a gracious gift from a gracious Creator who made the people of Israel a people who claimed them as his own and sent them on this journey, liberating them from bondage, and gave them this law as a way of understanding how they were to live in relationship to God, as God's claimed, chosen people in the world. One of the struggles that is revealed in the time of Jesus is that with many of the scribes and the Pharisees, that the law became the means of making oneself acceptable before God.
After having conducted these interviews, I found that the spiritual leaders knew more than I thought they did. Not to say that I was planning on proving them wrong with their statements when they interpreted the different scriptures. However, I did not realize how much of the historical background they really knew, but they do not share this historical background with us when they are giving homilies or sermons. I find this a little concerning because they are not sharing the knowledge that they know with us, and though I do know that if they were to state some of the historical facts that we do know at the pulpit, they may not have their jobs. It would also help the other Christians who are interpreting their Bibles to interpret in a more historical manner, leading it to be a more correct manner. In the end, this interview process wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I thought that I was going to interview 3 spiritual leaders, and that the closest to the historical accuracy would probably be the rabbi, and that I would be using E.P. Sanders' book to reference why the other 2 interpretations might be a little off. However, I found that I learned that our spiritual leaders know much more than I realized, and it allowed me to learn as well. And it was definitely a good experience and an eye-opening experience for myself and hopefully for you as well.